Right. Good evening. I understand that you would like me to go over Module 2, specifically the graphical economic analysis. I Am I right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Miss. Thank you very much, Miss Franz Regala. Okay, so I suppose you're referring to just a minute. Share screen. You'd be referring to this set of slides, would you? Okay, this one more than the other one, so I'll go through it. Okay, now this is the method by which economists would analyze uh, the a particular policy or action by government. Okay, it is always seen in terms of beneficiaries and those who lose out. Okay, in effect, if there is any action by government, it would always, or anyone actually, anyone, it would always benefit some people, and it would be a cost or a loss to other people. And the benefits and the losses, there are short term and there are long term. And in order to have a firm grasp on identifying beneficiaries and those who made the loss and what they gained and what they lost. Okay, one can use economic analysis. The basic structure used in economic analysis is to look at the supply and demand curve. Okay, now, let me begin from the start. When we talk about trade policy, such as the European Union trade policy, and the trade policy that's being encouraged by the World Trade Organization for all its member countries, and also why the Philippines, together with its ASEAN uh, neighbors, are also into the promotion of free trade. Okay, there is a basis for the promotion of free trade. Okay, but free trade by itself does bear some burdens on some groups of people, which is why there are a number of policies as well which are being justified even though they are not promoting free trade. There is there are justifications as to why such policies are being promoted. Okay, you'll see that when you look at the, the common agricultural policy. Okay, and also when you're talking of the competition policy and also the industrial policy in terms of why is it that the European Union member governments still provide subsidies for Airbus. Okay, well, there is a reason behind that. Okay, so let's begin by looking at what's known as the demand and supply framework. Okay, now the demand and supply framework is used in order to look at the and analyze a particular situation involving price changes and the like due to some government policy and the like. Okay. So if we look at demand, on the demand side, it would refer to the amount of a good that consumers are willing to obtain at a certain price level. Okay. Now, you know that when you want to buy something, okay, especially if you might be buying that for the first time, okay, you would have in you a certain price that you're willing to pay for that. Okay. And when you actually go out and look at it, if it turns out the selling price is below what you were willing to pay for it, then the argument is you feel a certain happiness. Okay? Hmm. And that is what's called the difference between the price that you're willing to pay and what the price turned out to be. Okay? Hmm. Then, so this demand side is on the part of individuals as buyers, as consumers. On the supply side, okay, this now refers to the sellers. Okay, supply is the amount of a good that producers are willing to sell. Okay, and they're willing to sell at a certain price level. When you have a seller who's willing to sell a good at a certain price, and he actually starts selling it and discovers that the actual selling price in the market is higher than the price that he was willing to sell it for, then again, the seller has what would be a certain experience of satisfaction. He or she is earning more than what he originally intended. Okay, so here's the graph here. Here on the demand curve, it's downward sloping, meaning to say the lower the price of the good, the more we are willing to purchase it. And here's the supply curve. From the point of view of the sellers, the higher the price in the market, the more you're willing to sell it. Okay? That's why whenever there is a flood or a calamity, okay, there might be a sudden increase in the selling prices of items such as food. Okay, but the sudden increase in selling price can be relieved. The fact that they have a sudden increase in prices would mean that the suppliers of food would supply more in order to take advantage of the higher price. Okay, and over time, with more of those food supply entering the market, okay, the market price would tend to go down. Okay, now if you have what's called a perfectly competitive market, okay, then there are many buyers and there also are many sellers. So many buyers, so many sellers, such that none can control the price. So the price is determined by the interaction of the demand and the supply curve. Okay. And that is the ideal market. So that's the reason why free trade is being encouraged. Because with free trade, um, you have a much larger group of sellers. Okay. So here in the Philippines, because we've allowed for free trade in fresh fruits, okay, we now have a huge supply of fresh fruits here, both tropical fruits and temperate zone fruits. We even get some of, occasionally we get our mangoes from abroad during periods of time when domestic production is not able to supply the domestic demand. And so that's why whenever you have free trade, there'll be more sellers in the market. Okay. But free trade brings along certain problems. But in any case, let's look first at how the free trade situation is supposed to look like. Okay. So when I told you a while ago that if the consumer is willing to buy one commodity, this one, Q sub dx, just be willing to buy one thing, for example, a car, for example, since you only buy one car at a time, okay, or perhaps a sweater, okay, and you're willing to pay a certain price, okay. For example, it's February, March, there's a sale at Thara, so and they're selling sweaters. So in order to purchase a Thara sweater, you'll be willing to pay a certain price. Okay? And when you actually go there and look at it, the price is much lower than what you were originally willing to buy it for. You only just want one, but the market price is determined by the interaction of all the buyers and sellers, not just you. So although you were willing to pay up to two in this instance here, the price would actually be one, then actually you have what's known as a consumer surplus, meaning to say you have that feeling of satisfaction from being able to obtain something at a price lower than you were willing to pay it for. Okay, so generally speaking, the lower the price of a good, the greater the consumer surplus, and therefore the greater the welfare for the buyers. Okay. And that, again, let me repeat, is what motivates arguments for having competition and for encouraging free trade. Because if there's free trade, there's greater competition among those that are selling in the markets of a certain country, are not just the local sellers, but foreign sellers as well. So with more sellers, the idea is there'd be greater supply of goods and services, and then the price for given demand would go down. All right. Okay. If you have any questions, please just raise your hand. Just click the reactions here, okay? Or you can unmute yourself and say something. Okay. Now let's look at the other side. Okay, Mr. Lawrence Kaga, you have a question?
Oh wait, hold on.
Okay.
Okay, never mind, sir. I'll ask it later. I seem to have forgotten it.
All right. Okay, so we proceed. Now, so this entire thing, this violet thing here, would be the consumer surplus of all buyers. Okay, so all buyers who were willing to pay the price for that Zara sweater at a price higher than what it turned out to be, these are the ones that experience that certain satisfaction, the consumer surplus. Okay. Of course, those who want to pay it at a much lower price will not get this consumer surplus. But at least for the large numbers of buyers, okay, they do experience a consumer surplus that the price of this good is lower than what they were willing to pay for it from the start. Okay. Now let's look at the producers. Okay. So for a producer, he's willing to sell one unit, like say a sweater or a car, and willing to sell it at a certain price, a low price, because he wants to sell just this one particular unit. And the price that he set it at piece of V equals 1 is a price that will allow him or her to have a certain profit, what is known as normal profit, the normal rate of profit in the market. Now, if it turns out that the actual selling price of this sweater or this car is not 1 but 2.5, he actually has a much bigger profit. So all of this triangle becomes what's known as a producer's surplus, which would be the difference between the actual market price and the price of this good that a lot of the sellers were willing to sell it. So so for these sellers, they actually are able to earn a substantial profit. This producer surplus is actually the profit of all the sellers in the market. not just one, but all. Because what determines the price of a good in a market where there are many buyers and sellers is the interaction of supply and demand. So when supply and demand interact and end up in a price of 2.5, so for those willing to sell at less than 2.5, they actually gain a profit. Okay. Those who wanted to sell at a higher price, they don't get much by way of the consumer surplus, and therefore they're not going to sell as much. Okay. Now, now, what if we now have trade with other countries? Okay. Let's say your home market, the Philippines, and the import market would be all the markets outside. Okay. In the local market, okay, here's the demand and the supply, and this is the domestic price. At point E, the domestic price here in the Philippines is P sub 0. Okay. But the international price for this good, so this good is being produced locally. They're local producers. Okay. At the same time, it's internationally traded. The international price is lower than the domestic price. It's at P sub 1. Okay. At P sub 1, buyers in the Philippines, in the home market, are willing to buy up to Q sub D sub 1 because the price is lower than P sub 0. But at P sub 1, domestic producers are only willing to produce up to Q sub S sub 1. So what will happen is this difference between Q sub D sub 1, the total that the domestic market is willing to buy at that price, and Q sub S sub 1, the total that the local producers are willing to produce and sell here, okay, this difference becomes the import demand. This is the size of the quantity that imports can fill in the local market. Okay. Now, the only producers, therefore, in the domestic market are those who can produce this good and still make a profit when the price is lower at P sub 1. Okay. So through that, you can have an import market. Okay. This is the import demand curve, which should be what level of imports shall be if the prices in the international market will go further down to P sub 2 or would go up to P sub 0. When the international price rises to P sub 0, then there is no need for imports. Okay, right. Now, let's look at the export supply curve. Okay. So let's say here in the Philippines, we are a major exporter of leather gloves. Okay. I don't know how many of you have been able to take your JTA, your junior term abroad. I certainly hope for some of you it would already be possible by next year because junior term abroad usually occurs in the winter. Okay. And many of you have posted your photos in the discussion board showing you in some wintry, cold place in Europe. You all had your jackets, your sweaters, and the like. Okay. If you happen to be there and purchase a set of leather gloves, well, chances are those leather gloves could have been manufactured here in the Philippines. Okay, you're a major exporter of leather gloves. Keep in mind that we don't need leather gloves here in the Philippines. Okay, but there's a big demand for leather gloves in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in Russia. Okay, and we are able to produce the leather gloves. We make Some of the leather we import, some of the leather, the linings, but we have a lot of laborers here who can produce and export the leather gloves at prices which are very competitive with leather gloves coming from other countries. Okay, so let us say this good, okay, is being produced here in the Philippines and has a domestic market, such as mangoes. Okay, so in the domestic market, okay, D sub H is the demand and S sub H is the supply for mangoes. And at point F, the intersection between the domestic and the domestic demand and domestic supply curve, the domestic price for the mangoes is P sub 0. Now, what if in the foreign market, the price is P sub 1? Okay. So at P sub 1, domestic buyers are only willing to purchase up to Q sub D sub 1. Okay. But domestic producers are willing to produce and sell up to Q sub S sub 1. Okay. So what will happen is that the Q sub S sub 1 minus Q sub D sub 1, this will not be purchased locally because the price is higher for many of the local buyers. So this particular quantity from QD sub 1 to QS sub 1 will then be exported. Okay, because there is a higher price in the international market. So you'll have what's called the export market. So whenever the international price increases higher than the domestic price, more and more of that good will be produced and sold abroad. And in fact, what will happen is the domestic price will end up rising to the level of the international price. Okay? Which, for example, is what has happened to our mangoes. Our prices for mangoes reflect international prices. They can be quite expensive, but at the same time, the supply of mangoes has hugely increased. Okay. I don't know how many of you are from Antipolo. Okay. But for those who been to Antipolo are familiar with Antipolo, okay, we have an old song during fiesta time in Antipolo, which is May. This is tayo na sa Antipolo at doon tayo'y maligo. There's a line there that says, kakain tayo ng suman, mangga, at doon kakain tayo ng mangga, suman, kasoy at balimbing. Okay, so it mentions mangga, suman, kasoy at balimbing. Why? In the olden days, mangoes are only available from April up to June. May was the harvest time for mangoes. Okay. But once you have this huge demand for mangoes in the international market, principally in Japan, but now also in Europe and Australia, which began sometime 1970s and onwards, okay? Local producers have developed techniques of being able to grow mango off-season. So right now, mangoes is no longer a seasonal fruit. It's available year-round, okay? And the spur for that has been the international market, the international demand for mangoes, okay? Right. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, if you notice, therefore, now there are some benefits to free trade. For consumers, there would be lower prices for goods and services. For producers, there could be um, greater market opportunities abroad because the prices are much higher. So we have uh, just a minute. Oh, someone wants to enter. Okay, Drew, Mr. Magbag, you have a question?
Hello. Sorry sir, no. Nag-raise lang ako kanina because I'm from Antipolo.
Ayun
Sorry,
pala eh.
I forgot to
No, it's okay.
sorry.
Tsaka hindi ko naman nakikita lahat ng ano niyo eh because I have to see the slides. So you're from Antipolo, very good.
Yes sir.
Yeah. So yun yung kanta ninyo. Ang piyesta sa Antipolo is Mayo. And then the kanta says, doon, kakain tayo ng mangga, suman, kasoy at balimbing. Okay, because May time, that's mango harvest season. You don't have mangoes at the rest of the year. It's only during the summer. In the 1960s, but the export of mangoes began fully fledged by 1980s. Kaya ganyan. So again, going back, free trade, as you can see, benefits consumers and domestic producers. Okay, so consumers could have access to more goods at lower price. Okay, producers can have a bigger market abroad, bigger market opportunities, and the like. However, generally speaking, the global market can be very volatile. It can be very unpredictable. Okay. For example, if you found out that there's a big market in Argentina for Philippine mangoes, okay, you might want to develop that and start exporting. And then the next thing you know, there's a sudden decrease in demand from Argentina, and you're caught with a huge supply of mangoes here that can rot because there are no buyers. Okay. So there's a certain volatility involved. In addition, countries have also imposed trade restrictions. Why? Okay. As I told you, when you are allowing free trade, more of those goods are available in the domestic market. And that means the domestic price will go down and be closer to the international price. Okay. But what if, so this means that domestic producers who are unable to produce these goods at this lower price will have to close shop and find some other business opportunity. Okay. And there are those that might want actually local production to be made possible because by locally producing this good, it creates employment, and at the same time, it promotes technical know-how. Okay. For example, when you're trying to encourage the domestic manufacture of cars and automobiles, okay, it creates a local supply of engineers and technicians. Okay, so that's why some countries want to promote the domestic manufacture of certain industrial products, partly because not only does it create employment, it develops domestic know-how. Okay, it develops engineering and technical know-how insofar as these uh, products are concerned. Okay? So that's one side of the trade picture. Now, on the export side, as I mentioned to you, it is possible that by engaging in international trade, domestic producers will be encouraged to produce those goods and take advantage of the higher international prices and the like. Okay. Now, the downside is that the buyers of your exports might impose restrictions if they want to prevent greater competition against their own producers. Okay? And at the same time, if more of the domestic producers engage in the production of this good, okay, then they might not anymore be involved in the production of certain other goods. Okay, so for example, it is said that with more and more domestic farms now focused in the production and export of fresh fruits and coffee, chocolate, and the like, okay, then lesser and lesser land is now being devoted to the production of rice. Okay, which is why making some restrictions on the exporting is also done by countries in order to promote certain industries. Okay, so when this is done, there are certain beneficiaries and certain losers. Okay, and that's the reason why it's worthwhile doing this analysis in order to find out who are uh, going to benefit and who are going to lose, so that somehow those that gain, okay, something can be done to obtain some of their earnings and to provide for those who made a loss. For example, when you have this rice tarification issue, among the gainers would be consumers in that there'll be a much lower price of bigas throughout our domestic economy. There'll be greater earnings as well for the sellers of bigas. But the losers are the rice farmers. Okay, so there's a possibility of collecting some of the taxes. So some of the taxes from the sale of bigas, and some of these can be used to provide some form of assistance to farmers, like credit or assistance in mechanization, so that they can improve on their farm efficiencies. Okay, so that's why we go through this analysis to identify who are the beneficiaries and who are the losers of a certain action, say in the European Union, in terms of the common agricultural policy, monetary integration, the competition policy, trade policy, and the like. Okay, so you do this because, as I said, the ideal is to keep the markets as free as possible. Okay, so by imposing some restriction, you can identify the beneficiaries of such a proposal and the ones who will be carrying the burden, and therefore you can develop means by which the beneficiaries can somehow compensate the ones who make a loss. You can see that, for example, in the common agricultural policy. Okay, so let's look here. So let's just summarize here. Okay, countries, although they're supposed to be encouraged towards free trade, historically have imposed restrictions on trade. And the most common restriction is to impose a tariff. Okay. What is your language, Mr. Kaga? Huh?
English, sir.
Of course, what I mean is your European language.
Oh, sorry.
My God.
Spanish, sir.
Okay. Muy bien.
Espanol.
En español. In English, tariff means a tax on an imported good. Okay? In Spanish, tarifa is the taxi fare. Okay? The Spanish word for a tariff is arancel. Okay? So, tariff is the most common form of trade restriction. It is a tax on an imported good. Okay? So, when the Philippines imposes a tariff on Ms. Regala says in French, tariff just means price. That's true. Tariff is a price in general, although it is most commonly used in reference again to transport fares like taxis. But parang sa Espanyol, when they use the word tarifa. Okay? I'm just not sure what the French word is for a tax on an imported good, but in Spanish it is arancel. Okay? Now, so what a tariff will do, if I can move ahead to the conclusion. What a tariff does is, by imposing this tariff, for example, the Philippine government imposes a tariff on the importation of sweaters, of clothes, and the like. Okay, so the imposition of the tariff means that the domestic price is higher than what it should be compared to the international price. Okay, now there are non-tariff barriers. It's listed in the other slide. Okay, I think it's here. In this other slide, there's a listing here of the other non-tariff barriers. Okay, but the effect of the non-tariff barriers is the same as that of a tariff, in the sense that usually a non-tariff barrier limits the domestic supply of an imported good, and therefore it limits the available domestic supply of the good. So the effect of that is, again, like that of a tariff, there's a higher price. The domestic price is higher than what it should be compared to what it would be in the absence of the tariff. Okay. For example, sugar prices in the European Union and in the United States of America are higher than the international sugar price because they impose tariffs on sugar that they import from outside the US, from outside the European Union. Okay. Now, so let's look at what will happen when you have a country that from the start imposes a tariff. Okay. First, okay. So let's say we have home country H, the foreign country F. H imports good K and F exports this particular good. And we'll just be doing the analysis here. Okay. The domestic price is the price that domestic consumers pay for this good. Border price is what the price of the exporters of this good receive for selling the good to H. Okay. So here, on the right side, that's the domestic demand and supply for this good. Okay. On the left side, on the right side, you have the international supply, which is the export supply curve for the home country, like the Philippines. Okay. So if the domestic price, okay, where DH and MH intersect, is equal to the international price, price of F sub T. So here's the case where domestic prices are equal to international prices. So it's completely free trade. Okay, the domestic price is equal to the international price. Okay, what if a tariff is imposed? What if the Philippines imposes a tariff on this good, say sugar, or the European Union imposes a tariff on this good? So the tariff shifts the supply curve to the left. Okay, so let's look closely. Here, okay, domestic suppliers are willing to sell at this price and at this quantity. That's what they're willing to sell at this price, at this quantity. Okay. And the domestic supply is a combination of what is locally produced and what is imported. Okay, because it's already free trading, which means from the very beginning, there is domestic production and there is importation. And the importation would be local importers, so they're willing to sell at this price. So the sum total of the supply of this good, the sugar that they're willing to sell at this international prices up to here. But now a tariff has to be paid. So the tariff shifts to the left. What does this mean? At this price level, local producers and sellers are willing to sell up to here at this price. But now, okay, at this particular level of supply, okay, the price, the domestic price goes up there because it's way higher than what local. It says my internet connection is unstable. Are you still all able to hear me? Okay. Oh, good. Okay, so I'll proceed. Okay. So again, so at this price, this higher price with the tariff, domestic buyers are willing to buy up to here only. So this new supply curve with the tariff intersects the domestic demand at this particular price. So there will be a reduction in the domestic selling price. It is not, the price is not the original price times the tariff. No, it's only slightly up to here. Why? Because at the price plus the full tariff, the demand level is not here, okay? It's over there. So what will happen is there'll be a new domestic price equilibrium between the demand and supply, and it will be over here due largely to the tariff. Okay, any questions so far? Right, because now we are going to identify beneficiaries and losers. Okay, so here it is. Originally, domestic supplies up to M sub ft, but with the domestic price now at P sub ht, the domestic demand and supply will end up being at M sub t. It's much lower than before. That is the domestic supply that equals the domestic demand. Okay? Now, in the exporting country, so let's say this country is exporting sugar to the Philippines, or say a country like Cuba exporting sugar to the European Union. The free trade price used to be at PFT, okay? But now the price here in this market in the Philippines, in the European Union, is no longer P sub FT, no longer free trade price, but P sub HT, okay? Price with the home tariff there, okay? And the difference from P sub H and T represents the tariff that the domestic importer now has to pay. Okay. Or in some instances, it's the tariff that the exporter has to pay to sell the good into the country, into the Philippines. Okay. So now the amount of good exported by the foreign country to H has gone down. They used to export up to X sub FT. They've reduced it to X sub T. Okay, they no longer can export as much as they used to because the price in the home market has gone up. So the demand for the good has decreased. And in the domestic market, domestic supply decreased from M sub FT to MT. At the higher domestic price, P sub HT. Okay. So what are the effects of a tariff? On the foreign side, it used to be that the free trade price was PFT, but now um, they have to pay a tariff, the sellers, the exporters from the foreign country, say from Cuba, they now have to sell and pay for the tariff when they are exporting to the Philippines. So they no longer are able to take advantage of the per unit price of sugar at P sub FT. Okay. They now have to pay a tariff equivalent to the domestic price P sub HT minus T, the tariff. P sub HT is the domestic price in the Philippines. Okay. So where Cuba was able to sell at P sub FT and enjoy all that as the revenue, now they can now sell at P sub HT, the domestic price in the Philippines, less the tax. Okay. So what happens is A is the loss that the Cuban exporters experienced because of the price decrease, export price decrease. And B is the loss because they now are exporting less. Okay. So as you can see, you've divided the loss into two parts. One, the loss due to the change in price, which is A. B is the loss due to the change in the demand. Okay. So any questions so far? Okay. So let's proceed. Now, how about in the home market? Okay. So in the home market, it used to be P sub FT was the free trade price. Now the domestic price is P sub HT. Okay. Domestic sales used to be M sub FT. Now it's lesser at M sub T. Okay. So what is C? C is the loss in consumer surplus because we now pay more. Okay. What used to be quite inexpensive, we now pay more. Okay, so there's a loss in consumer surplus. Okay, now C is the loss in consumer surplus because of the price increase. D is the loss in consumer surplus because there are lesser purchases. Okay, so there's the price effect, there's the quantity effect. The price effect means there's a much higher price, so we no longer are enjoying it as before because we pay more. At the same time, there's also the loss because we are buying less. Okay, right. So now let's look at the distributional aspect of it. Let's do the analysis here. Okay. What if, say, here's the domestic market for this good, and that's the import market. Let's say this is the market for personal computers. Let's say here in the Philippines, there is a local producer of personal computers. Yeah, dahil dito sa Pilipinas siguro ang pangalan ng personal computer na yan, hindi Apple. I suppose it would be Mango, something like that. Although mango here, of course, damit yun eh. So let's think of another fruit. Lakatan. Okay, yan. Lakatan. Okay. Yung mga nag-French dyan, di ba? That's the usual greeting. Okay. Ça va? Lakatan. Okay. Latondong. Okay. So let's say ito. In the domestic market, okay, this is the demand for personal computers. And for those that produce the Lakatan personal computer, ito yung kanilang supply, meaning to say, this is what they're willing to produce and sell at the given prices. Okay. And so the domestic price for personal computer is at P sub 0, okay, which is way above the international price, which is P sub FT. So therefore, there is an incentive for the producers of Apple to sell here kasi ang taas ng domestic price. So they would export to the Philippines, we would import. Our total import is from K sub FT to S sub H1. Okay. Why is it that K sub FT? That is how much domestic buyers are willing to purchase the personal computer at the P sub FT level. Okay. But at P sub FT, local producers of Lakatan laptop computers are only willing to supply up to S sub H1. Okay. So the difference between the domestic demand and the domestic supply is filled in by imports. Okay? Okay. So now let's proceed. Ayan. So, if what we're now doing is we're just putting together yung welfare effects between the foreign and the home country, just so that you can see how the analysis goes. Kaya, pag may domestic market dito, yung mga, if a tariff is imposed on Apple computers, usually that is to encourage the domestic production of laptop computers. It's to encourage the producers of the Lakatan laptop computer. Okay. And the idea for that is to create a domestic manufacturing capacity for electronics and also to create jobs for engineers and technical people who know how to work and manufacture laptops. Okay. So now, with the tariff being imposed, the domestic price rises from P sub FT to P sub HT. Okay. And in the domestic market, at P sub HT, the demand decreases to K sub HT. Okay. But at this price, P sub HT, domestic producers are willing to increase their production from SH1 to SH2. Okay? Right. So what will happen is the importations will decrease. It used to be from KFT to SH1. Now, it will decrease from SH2 to KHT because of the higher domestic price for laptop computers because a tariff was imposed. Okay. So what will happen? C for the producers of Apple, okay, C is the loss of the producers because now it used to be that C is the consumer surplus loss. I'm sorry. C is the consumer surplus loss in the international market because now the prices they were affected by the fact that you now have a tariff here in this exporting country. D is the consumer loss because of the decrease in importation. Now in the domestic market, U, okay, is the gain of the domestic producers, the producers of Lakatan. Okay. V is the loss of consumers. W is also the loss of consumers. X is the loss of consumers. U is also part of the loss of this entire thing here is the loss of consumer surplus. But This U is the gain of domestic producers. So by the imposition of a tariff, domestic producers do gain. They have higher profits than before. But consumers' surplus loss is also the case. And if you look at the way the supply and demand curves are constructed, the net loss is higher because U plus W plus V plus X is the loss of the consumers. The gain of the producers is U. Moreover, V, okay, the W from X is what's called the dead weight loss. That is the loss simply because of the change in consumption patterns. We're purchasing less of it because of the higher price and we're paying a higher price. Okay. V, however, is the tariff revenues of the government. V and Y is the tariff revenues of the government. Okay. So before, there were no tariffs at all. Okay. But with the tariff, the domestic price goes up. This tariff, okay, is now being earned by the government. Okay, government gains in the difference between the domestic price, H sub T, okay, minus the tariff level, which is P sub HT minus T, which is up to here. So U is the gain of domestic producers. V and Y is the increased revenue of the government. Okay. UWVX is the loss of consumer surplus in the Philippine market. So as you can see, the beneficiaries are domestic producers and the government. Okay, the ones who make a loss would be the consumers. Okay, so by doing this analysis, you can say that with the bigger revenues government is having, it can try to find some way of compensating consumers. Okay, either a straightforward cash grant or the revenues can be used to fund projects that will increase consumer employment and incomes, so that even though the prices now are higher than what it used to, with more jobs and more incomes, more people will be able to afford the higher price for this particular good. Okay. Right. Any questions? So, okay, ganito. So, generally speaking, although free trade has its benefits, it has a downside. The downside being the sheer unpredictability of international market forces and the like, which is why historically countries have imposed tariff and non-tariff restrictions towards goods and trade. So in tonight's analysis, this particular PowerPoint here is an analysis by which you're able to identify that when government imposes a tariff, okay, who are the losers and who are the gainers, so that to a degree, gainers can compensate the losers. Okay. So that, therefore, is the motivation behind the formation of a regional economic association. Okay. So what will happen is, for the European Union countries, okay, so okay, you have the producers and the consumers in France, whereas before, they could impose tariffs on all imports that they have. Okay, by forming and being part of the European Union, they're now part of a much larger market, and in this larger market, free trade is the rule. So the consumers and producers of France and the other European Union member countries are able to reap the benefits of free trade among them because individual countries now face a much larger market. However, because of the volatility and unpredictability of international market forces, they impose tariffs on goods coming from outside the European Union. So that is the motivation behind encouraging free trade, but at the same time, forming regional economic associations. Okay, because the regional economic associations will not expose a country to the unpredictability of the international global market. Okay, but at least it will open up the domestic producers and consumers of a market to a larger market, and that's the market of the entire regional association. Okay, and that is what other regional associations are trying to replicate. So we're doing that in the association of Southeast Asian nations, and at the same time, the European Union and other countries in the world are trying to extend the reach of their free trading by forming free trade agreements. Okay. So I leave you for a few minutes. I need to answer the call of nature. You know, that's my age. So I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so just to give you a preview of coming attractions, if you look at the Common Agricultural Policy, among the things that you will develop an appreciation for is that by the Common Agricultural Policy, a wide range of agricultural products, when imported to the European Union, you have to pay a tariff. Okay. The aim is to protect the European Union producers of these commodities. They're usually those agricultural commodities, the food items that are native to the European countries, like their local sugar, their wheat, their grains, their potatoes, their fish, and the like. Okay, so they impose tariffs on importations of these. Okay, and the tariff revenue here goes to the European Union. And this tariff revenue they now use to, among other things, provide subsidies to their agricultural producers. Okay. Now, as for consumers, the consumers would be paying a much higher price than if the tariffs were removed. However, it's argued that the higher price is actually not that much. Okay, and it's spread out through all the consumers of the European Union. So there really is not any huge complaint about the fact that they're paying higher than the international price because the difference is not that much. Okay, because their domestic production is able to keep up with the domestic demand. Now, a lot of the revenues, however, go towards providing subsidies to their farmers so that farmers can continue with their production and their traditional practices and the like. Okay. Mr. Masigan, what's your language, by the way?
Spanish, sir.
Ah, muy bien. Exacto. Do you like paella?
Um, yes.
What paella? Have you tasted actual Spanish paella?
I have no idea.
Okay. Kasi yung paella dito sa Pilipinas, yung paella Valenciana, is actually cooked differently from how the Spaniards really cook their paella. Okay? Because
Yes.
kasi tayo, when we do our paella, do you like, or well, before, nung wala pang quarantine, did you like eat all you can buffet?
Depends.
Oh my God, Mr. Masigan. But anyway, you know that paella is a usual dish served in Vikings and other buffets. I see the smile on your face when I mentioned Vikings. It seems like you miss it a lot, okay?
Actually,
So you,
sir,
ano na nga ba yung buffet sa ano na nga ba yung buffet sa UP Town Center?
sir, may I add something?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Funny thing about Vikings,
What?
funny thing about Vikings.
Ah.
My mother thought it would be a good idea for the family to eat at Vikings on Sunday.
Maybe kung naman talaga may some buffets have already opened. However, they restrict they restrict the number of people in a table. And if we belong to the same family, I think okay lang. But if you're going out on a buffet this coming Sunday, well, enjoy yourself. Okay? Somehow this Sunday naman, I'm going to treat myself. My usual indulgence is an Italian lunch. And you know what Italian lunch for me means? There's pasta, salad, dessert, and wine. But anyway, going back, the reason why I mentioned to you about paella kasi real Spanish paella uses a certain type of bigas, which is different from what we use. The bigas that we use is for our paella, like what we call paella Valenciana, like what you get in Vikings, that uses our local bigas. But the bigas that the Spaniards use is different. It's quite different. And that particular bigas is the sort of bigas that cooks very well in what is called their paellera. There's a special kawali for paella. It's a very big uh, flat kawali. Okay, yeah, you cannot use a wok because a wok is it's shaped this way. In contrast to the paella, which is paellera, which is flat, and it has to be cooked in a certain way. So what happens is among Spaniards, they're very, very particular about that particular rice being in paella. So although the bigas of the Philippines might be cheaper, they wouldn't want to import it and turn it into their paella because for them, paella uses that specific type of bigas. Okay, so they therefore will restrict the importation of other forms of bigas because they want to protect that type of bigas, that production of that type of bigas, because that's the thing that they want for their paella. Okay, just as when Españoles have this jamón serrano, they'd like it to be cured in a certain way. Merong jamón serrano dito made in the Philippines, but it's different from the Spanish jamón serrano because jamón serrano in Spain is dried and cured in the open air. And the weather in Spain is dry. Ours here is humid, and that's the reason why the jamón serrano here will end up being much more moist compared to the ones that they have in Spain. And therefore, the Españoles would say that you cannot call that jamon serrano because jamon serrano means it has to follow the process and procedure they do in España, and it's done within their climatic conditions. Okay, so you will see that the common agricultural policy involves free trade in food produced within the European Union. Okay? But they impose tariffs, restrictions on countries exporting food to them. Okay, the only ones that might enjoy tariff-free exportation of food items would be those countries that they'd be having a free trade agreement with. Okay. So I hope you enjoy your Vikings celebration this coming Sunday, Mr. Masigan.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. I'll be having my Italian lunch, my treat to myself for having given several synchronous classes this week here to make up for the loss of classes from last week. So I'll be doing my Italian lunch. And you know that Italian lunch involves not just pasta, there has to be wine, but there also has to be fresh green salad. Eh, don't forget when people say na healthy daw ang French, Italian, Spanish cooking, they say it's because of the carbs and the wine. They forget that essential to their dish is salad. There's always a fresh green salad in every meal that they have. You know, Mr. Masigan, I suddenly am very hungry. Mr. Masigan, are you fond of the Marvel superheroes?
Not a super fan, but I watch them.
Ah, good. I see. Sinong paborito mo? Si Chris Pratt, si Chris Pine, si Chris Evans, si Chris Hemsworth, o si Chris Pipata?
I don't like crispy pata. But I do
Oh,
like Chris Pratt.
who?
But I do
Chris-
like Chris Pratt.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot understand all those memes about him. You know, when he's supposed to crack a joke and then the others get angry and start to beat him up. But anyway. Well, anyway, masarap naman ang crispy pata. We
Not
would
for me,
agree to
sir.
that. Not for you, well, for the others. I suppose Mr. Kaga or Mr. Inocentes also like crispy pata. Do you know what pata means, Mr. Masigan?
Is it like a all I know is the way I see it's like a snack.
No, the word pata, do you know what it means?
Oh no.
Huh?
Not literally, sir.
Pata is the Spanish word for the leg.
Ah.
Kaya lahat tayo may pata. Ikaw may pata. Okay, it just so happens here in the Philippines, we use that word pata specifically just for that type of leg. Yeah, you know, the deep fried pork leg. But pata is the Spanish word for a leg. Kaya dito sa Pilipinas, yung mga Pinay, whenever they say, nako, ang papangitan ng pata ko, what they mean is that they have very, very fat legs. When actually, lahat tayo may pata. Okay. Okay, any questions so far? I will be posting a recording of this lecture. Okay. And by the way, okay, Miss Regala, I have a question.
Sir, I just have a question with regards to customs unions, because something that I found interesting. I did my
Okay,
GPA
customs union.
in Latvia, and something that I found interesting was the Baltics apparently has had efforts to try to push for a customs union, but it always fails. There's like well, of course, in their context they have Russian intervention, etc. But what are like who are the losers in a customs union, and who are the typical, I guess you could say, beneficiaries, especially factoring in yung tariffs into the
Okay, pag may customs union ka, among the losers would be the consumers inside that customs union. Because mangyayari, products that come from outside would be imposed the same tax. Ang customs union, ang original customs union were the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So what happened was, okay, they decided na within those countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, the Benelux, okay, they decided not to have tariffs with each other, mag-free trade sila. But when it comes to countries outside these three, there's a common tariff. So yan ang customs union. So the beneficiary here would be the domestic producers of the Benelux countries. Major losers would be yung mga consumers. Okay. Yun ang immediate effect. In the long run, it is possible that domestic production of these goods can increase, and therefore it would increase employment, and therefore there'll be more incomes even among the consumers of the Benelux countries. And ang Latvia is a member of the European Union.
Yes.
Kaya they don't need to form a customs union. The entire European Union is a customs union. Okay? In fact, Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland are not European Union member countries, but they're part of the customs union, meaning to say all the goods coming from outside the European Union, when they get into these countries, they impose the same tax as the European Union, which they send to the European Commission. And dahil customs union sila, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland cannot make their own agreements with other countries. They just have to follow the decisions done by the European Union. That was the original plan of Theresa May. For the UK would have left the European Union, can no longer be part of the political decision making, but at least as far as the market is concerned, they'll still be part of the customs union. Ayaw nila nila Boris Johnson at saka nila Nigel Farage. They want a complete break. So, kasi if it's a customs union, the European Commission makes decisions on the trade policy. Walang magagawa dun yung Norway, Iceland, Switzerland. Okay, any more questions? Again, I'll be posting a copy of this, oh wait, I think there are questions. Sandali lang. Where is just a minute, sorry. I'm trying to chat. Yeah, Ally by Vikings. Apologies for this semi-unrelated question, but may I ask, are there ways in order to get around the tariff rules? Ay nako, Iha, are there ways to get around the tariff rules in the EU? Panoorin mo sa Discovery or National Geographic Channel, Border Control Europe, yun. You see all those people trying to smuggle all sorts of goods inside the European Union. One of the controversial issues is that anong tawag nito, yung sa Italy, okay, nagreklamo sila. I do not know if they've acted on this. So many Chinese firms established themselves in Italy. So they are now registered as European Union firms. Okay. Then the next thing you know, itong mga Chinese firms were selling mga Italian branded products, mga Prada, Gucci, and the like, which are actually manufactured in China. They are, tawag nito, yung mga fake versions. Okay. But the thing is, ewan ko kung na-action na, but many of the Italian firms were complaining. And the Italian government cannot do anything kasi European Union issue ito. But I do not know if the European Commission has already acted upon this. When I first heard of this 5 years ago. Okay. That's why you're telling me ways to get around the tariff rules. Ayun. Smug. That happens. Now, if you're talking about legal ways to get around the tariff rules in the EU, that's when countries negotiate for a free trade agreement. Okay. Okay, you're welcome, Ms. Velasco. Any more questions? Again, as I told you, I'm going to post the recording of this. I found out pala na Zoom actually deletes the recording after 2 weeks. So once I post it, including all the other previous classes we had, I would advise you to download it already because after 2 weeks, they automatically delete it. Okay. Okay, any more questions or comments that you might have? Okay.
Sir, just an administrative matter. Some
Yes.
people are asking for help obtaining the other readings aside from the main book that was sent.
Yung other readings, I think the one na you might need online copies of would be yung EU and ASEAN regionalism. Thing is, I do have a copy but I don't have a scanner. Now, alam ko, ewan ko kung friend mo si Director BJ Enverga, but I know he has a scanned copy. I don't know if you can ask him. Also, si Jeric Chonloc, I also know he has a scanned copy. Also, if you know Mr. Joshua Cabal, he took this course with me last year. He's fourth year EU major. Alam ko meron din siyang scanned copy. I personally don't. I never got to ask them eh. Okay. Most of the other readings I know are available online. Pero sa EU and ASEAN regionalism, yun ang hindi ko pa alam na digitize na. Which is actually helpful for you, lalo na yung article ni Dr. Paderon. She has a very clear exposition of the economic aspect. So that once you already understand how to identify beneficiaries and losers of tariff and the like, then you could better understand that one by Dr. Paderon. Okay? Right. Any more questions or comments? Okay. All right. So I hope you enjoy your family buffet this coming Sunday, Mr. Masigan. Which Vikings are you going to, may I ask? Ay, tinanong pa yung nanay. I was just curious. You don't need to bother. Yes.
Apparently, maybe MOA.
Sa MOA. Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay. I'm getting a warning that says that my network bandwidth though is low. So there are no more questions. I guess I can call it a night. So I'll see you at our next class synchronous meeting sometime March before your examination. Okay. Right. So for the moment, okay. Good evening. I do not know. Ayan. Good evening. Bye-bye. Okay, my pleasure.
Thank
My
you, sir.
My pleasure. Night.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, good night, Mr. Masigan. Okay, I'll end the meeting na ha. Okay, bye-bye.